First of all, I live in Ohio. And so usually I call this Oceans of Ohio, and I like the alliteration, but I just changed it to Tennessee because we're here today. And realistically, what I'm going to talk about mostly are some lesson plans that date to Ordovician age rocks, which are the same age bedrocks that you have throughout much of Tennessee. And so the fundamental concepts and kind of way you can couch this lesson works exactly the same here. So that's exciting. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a professor of geology in the Geological Sciences Department. I also participate in our biology group, and I work with teachers in the College of Education, faculty members there that are involved in teacher education, science education. And so associated with my colleagues over there, we've done a lot of professional development, workshop building, and things like that. And so the lesson plans I'll talk about today are some of the things that we've developed together. So I'm not a teacher. I'm a scientist. And so my role is as the content expert. And so as far as the pedagogical expertise, that's the educators that I work with. But we've been working with it for a while, so I feel comfortable talking about it. So a little bit about what we've been doing is that overall, fossils are phenomenal. Everybody loves fossils, really. I mean, it doesn't matter how old you are, and particularly the younger you are, the more you tend to like fossils. And fossils are just a wonderful way to talk with students about change through time. And so we can look at the rocks underneath us here in Tennessee. This is an ocean. It's not an ocean now. And we can leverage that interest and sense of place learning with the place-based education type idea of like, what do we have here? And how can we actually use that to get at some of these concepts? And so that's kind of what we're dealing with. Now, I use this same lesson plan with kind of any age group. I use it when I do public outreach at the professional level. I use the same lesson plan in my college classes, and we've used it in middle grade and high school classrooms as well. And elementary school kids love fossils most of all. So this kind of works across the curriculum. So one of the things we really want to do is actually get kids out in the field, but that's not always possible. You may have limitations on where you can go, safety of outcrops, and all kinds of other reasons that you can't go outside. But that doesn't mean you can't bring outside in. And so the boxes of rocks that you've been playing with, all of these are rocks from around the Cincinnati, Ohio area. And they're the same kinds of fossils that you could acquire around here. So we're going to kind of leverage what we have available to us. Our students are used to seeing rocks all over the hillsides as you drive by. You know, there's outcrops, and the same thing is true here. There's rocks everywhere you look. So in Ohio, all of the geology of Ohio relates to the Paleozoic interval, and all of our rocks are basically oceans, unless they're a coal swamp. So outside of that, in Ohio, everywhere you are in the state, you can talk about oceans. And we'll be talking about this stuff here. This is the Ordovician, and that's the same ocean that was here in Tennessee. So overall, we've been working on this professional development program, and so we like acronyms, of course, like everybody. So we called it Silas. And this was a year-long program that was funded by the Ohio Board of Regents for a teacher improvement grant. And what we did with this was we worked with a group of 25 teachers from the Appalachian region of Ohio, and we brought them onto campus for a week, and we did full-day workshops for a week, teaching different content areas, and then my teacher education colleagues went into their classrooms and worked with them throughout the year. And so in particular, we focused on 5E learning cycle aligned lessons. And so how many of you are 5E learning cycle aficionados? 5E, yeah, okay. A couple of you, and the rest will be soon. So great. I didn't know what the 5E lesson was when I first got involved with this group, but I actually use it pretty much now as the main way that I teach my college classes also. So we work to align with Ohio's learning standards and then tying that into the next generation science standards. Associated with that work, my research group in geology was working on a couple of other things because I study these Cincinnati rocks for my primary research project. And what we've been doing is actually building digital resources that allow us to actually get people assistance with using the local fossil record. And so here are my cards. So we've got a website. We also have a free iOS app for iPads and iPhones that are good for identifying the fossils that you may encounter in the rocks. About the same species live here in Tennessee. So it's useful here too. And so let me tell you a little bit about, I'm going to skip forward and tell you a little bit about the info I just passed out. So our website looks like this. Actually, one of the lead architects of the website was Jen Bauer during her master's program. And what we have are over 170 species that are included within this website. And there are a variety of different resources. So up at the top, we have resources for teachers. If you click on that tab, you can find all the lesson plans we'll talk about today, as well as a couple other lesson plans. And all the handouts you need, right? Because that's really, really helpful. And in some cases, I've got a grading rubric that we'll hand you today too. So that's here. If you go to any of the particular species pages, you'll find information like this, where you've got the classification, you've got information about what kind of environment that critter lives in, which particular rocks around the Cincinnati area you can find it in, and then detailed information about how you actually can tell it's this species and not another one that looks really similar. So the idea here was to actually bullet point this, rather than writing a long description that involves a whole pile of jargon, to actually try and make this accessible. In Cincinnati, we have a tremendously large amateur or avocational paleontological community. And so part of our goal was to make this basically for the public. So I use it with my college students, and a lot of the faculty around Ohio that lead field trips to this area do that as well. But that's not the major goal. The major goal is actually make this accessible for the public. The app simplifies things even more. So the website has a lot more information. The website or the app has a little bit less, but the same idea. You've got your fossils, and so there are 3 time periods. There's actually Pennsylvanian, Neogene, and which are rocks along the Gulf Coast, and then the Ordovician stuff. And so you can go through it 2 ways. You can either go through taxonomy. Let's say, okay, I know I've got a trilobite, and so click on Arthropoda and go down through the systematics. Or you can just say, okay, please, I want to see all the arthropods, or in this case, all the brachiopods, and it'll show you pictures of all the brachiopods in there, and then you can click on any of the particular species that looks the most like what you have. And then that takes you back to some of the same information. So this is the same set of bullet points that we had on the website, as far as explaining how to identify things, when does it live, and then pictures that you can zoom in on, and then we've got maps for where around the Cincinnati area these guys live. So our app and database is very specific to the Cincinnati region, because that's what we were looking at, but these rocks that are here are pretty similar, and the genera are largely overlap. So it can be a good use for that. Okay. So the first lesson plan I want to talk about is what I like to call Oceans of Ohio. We recently published it in Science Scope, and they changed the name to Using Observations of Fossils to Reconstruct Ancient Environments. So which is descriptive, and I suppose it doesn't mention Ohio, which is a good thing since it's a national journal. But the overall idea works with any rocks, and they don't have to be Ordovician rocks. They can be fossils of any age. So whatever is nearby, where I know that we have teachers from all over the state, whatever rocks are nearby where you are, they can work with these rocks, whatever you have. And so the idea is to get students to actually observe anatomical details, think about some aspects of how do we identify different types of organisms, look at how fossil preservation provides particular biological information, demonstrate that the organisms colonizing the same environment change through time. So we'll talk about marine organisms here, and as you all know really well, the oceans 450 million years ago, the critters that live there, are not the same critters that you'll find off the coast of Florida today. And this gives you a chance to kind of explore that change through time with students, with some actual data that they're holding about critters that are very different than critters they might see, if they go to the coast now. So overall, by the end, the students should be able to use drawings and descriptions to identify key fossil groups, to use organisms to reconstruct ancient environments, and to explain the evidence for why we can reconstruct oceans or whatever environment you're looking at in the past. So we're using a lot of observational statements as far as kind of the way to go. In terms of Ohio's learning standards, we look at kind of these align really well with aspects of 4th grade, aspects of 8th grade. Tennessee standards, I'm sure, are slightly different. But it works within both a biological emphasis and within an earth history or physical science emphasis, because you can play it in a couple different ways. And so under the next generation science standards, we're basically looking at inquiry and analysis, making observations, and then developing hypotheses. And so kind of tying these different threads together. All right, so let's do it. All right, so now you're my class, and so you're welcome to be any age grade level you prefer. So one of the things that we do in the 5E learning cycle, I'm sorry, let me go back because we're, a lot of you haven't used this particular teaching tool. What we do in the 5E learning cycle is we go through 5 stages of the lesson, and each of them start with E. So we start with, where do we start? Engagement. So which is where you capture the interest of your students, and then you give them materials to explore. After they've explored, then you provide the explanation. So that's when you actually can rehash, and if you're going to do note-taking and stuff like that, it usually happens at this phase. After that, you ask students to take those principles they learned and elaborate, or to kind of further explore the ideas. And then, of course, there's an evaluation phase that can occur at any stage. So we're going to start with engaging. Okay, so this is some of the teachers we worked with at our workshop. But all right, so starting with our engagement plan. So everybody knows a lot about fossils, right? So let's talk about that. Let's use that core information that your students already have and talk about what we know about fossils. Okay, so there are a couple of key questions that we can start with. We could start with, what's a paleontologist? Okay, so what is a paleontologist? I'm one, but what is a paleontologist? What do paleontologists do? No, really, you're my students, so let's talk. Yeah. They can study dinosaurs. Paleontologists do study dinosaurs. Some do. I don't. But I have some friends that do. So paleontologists can study dinosaurs. They can also study some other things. What are some other things paleontologists can study? Rocks. Can study rocks. Okay, so when we look at rocks, we want to know a couple of things. We might be interested in just extracting the organisms, but we might also be interested in learning about the environment based on the details of the rocks. Are they living in a beach environment? Is this a river environment? Is it a desert environment? So we want to look at the rocks to actually get clues about those environments. What other things do paleontologists do? Where do paleontologists work? They work in the field. Okay, so one of the things that typically students like to talk about is that paleontologists go on digs. And most of the time we actually don't use shovels. That's actually what archaeologists do. Our stuff is a rock, so shovels are not real helpful. Hammers are much more helpful. So we're actually not physically digging a whole lot, but we like to call them digs. And so yeah, we go out in the field. And when we're in the field, we take data. What kind of data do we collect? We look at the age of rocks. Okay. Age of rocks is a really important concept in a lot of ways. Every time we're talking about paleontology, we're always couching our information on how old it is. And so today we're talking about the Ordovician. It's 450 million years old. I don't actually like talking about numbers because numbers are whatever. I like talking about things in order. I'm a relative time person. All paleontologists really are. But how do we know things are old? Well, the first thing we can do is look at relative ages, right? And so the rock record is like a big book, and the older stuff on the bottom. And then it's the first way we made the geologic timescale. So the geologic timescale itself, all those great names like Ordovician and Pennsylvanian, those all date back to the early 1800s, actually before Darwin was born. We already had the geologic timescale in place. What is much more recent is putting those numbers on things, because that requires radiometric dating, and we didn't have any radiometric anything until the Curies and those guys actually figured out radioactivity. So that was much, much later. Now when we have ash layers and we have things that are the right age, we can actually do that. We can get the radiometric dates. But one of the key things that I like to talk about with my classes is that when we think about ages of rocks, it actually, numbers are great, whatever. And that helps us understand the Earth and put things into context. But we actually have a real sequence of events that has been in place and been understood for a very long time, and that's actually doesn't matter how old they are. We really know what the order is and that things have really changed. Okay, so another thing that's fun to do is list as many types of fossils as you can. So, okay, we're going to, like, everybody, like, clear your brains and then do quick word association. I say fossil, you say? Trace fossils, dinosaurs, teeth. Did you say elephants? Imprints, okay. We have fossil elephants. In Tennessee, we've got fossil elephants. That's fun. Other things? What? Humans? Hominids? What? Intact, so things that are articulated. All right. Now, that's a pretty good representation. And when you ask your students this question, you'll probably get pretty similar responses. But this is also a really nice, it's a great thing to do with just general biology. For teaching systematics, this is another great question. Just list all the animals you can in like top 20 animals, or give them a minute and sheet of paper, list everything they can, and then do a think, pair, share, and share your lists. One of the things that you'll find, whether you're talking about modern or fossil things, is that almost everything on these lists will be vertebrates, right? But of course, vertebrates represent a very small percentage of life today and ever. And so this is a nice question to actually springboard into the fact that while dinosaurs are neat, and so are a lot of like things at the Gray fossil site, they're really cool. Most of our fossils aren't vertebrates. And that's partly because there are less vertebrates alive than anything else, but partly because of where they live. It's actually hard to get buried if you live on land. If you live in something like an ocean or a lake, it's much easier to get buried. And so most of our fossil record comprises these aqueous organisms, because it's easy to bury them. And most of them are invertebrates because, well, they're easy to get buried, but also because that's what most critters are invertebrates. And of course, we also have a lot of fossil plants. And we have a lot of fossil microbes, so single-celled organisms, tons of fossils. And so there's lots of different, so this is a nice question to kind of bring in some of those other attributes that you might, if that's part of what you're trying to work with your students on this year, this is a place to reconnect with some of those themes you may be working with. Okay, so now we're engaged. We're all like, oh yes, fossils are cool, and we just remembered that oceans have fossils, and that all fossils are not actually dinosaurs. So let's explore. So at this point, we hand out the box. You see your box looks just like this box, and you've got a worksheet. So what we do at this point is we give students our boxes and we ask them to identify them. So within the boxes, you've got examples of all of these things. You also have some other things. So you'll have pieces of trilobites, little bits of crinoids, but absolutely all of these things. And so depending on the level of student you're working with, what I like to do is, first of all, have students take their rocks and stick them just in the spot on top of, okay, well, these are Brachiopods, let's put them all here together. These are clams, let's put them all here together. And sort your fossils. And then once they're sorted, ask the students to generate a description. So how can you identify a brachiopod versus a coral? Or versus, so what identifies? What are the anatomical features that allow you to identify this as that particular type of organism? Okay, so go. Let's walk around and look at these things for a little while. Here, everybody needs handouts. If you want to rock around and help them figure out what are what's, that's good too. Oh, Brachiopod. That's my favorite species, actually.
That one was the one that jumped out at me.
Yeah, that's a Vinlando's Turfia. They're my favorites. Yes, and that's really common. The rocks around Cincinnati are basically just chock full of this. Basically, there were storms, and that would wash away the fine grains and just leave piles of shells behind. And so these are just basically lithified piles of shells, which, yeah, they're a lot of fun. I grew up with these, which is, I think, why I'm a paleontologist now. All right, you got corals, bryozoans, you got your snail, all very exciting. All right. Yeah, so here's your trace going through here. Ah, so this guy is all spirally, right? So that's your gastropod. This is an interior brachiopod.
Oh, okay.
So I'll talk a little bit about brachiopods versus clams after one's had some time to explore.
Well, this is oh, it's
That's
the
your
clam.
clam, yeah. All right, how's it going? Oh, so many brachiopods. Actually, they're all brachiopods. No, well, so because this is your clam.
Okay.
And I'll talk a little bit to the group, but at this age in time, most of the clams build their shells out of a mineral that dissolves. And so you usually just get an internal mold of the clams, whereas the brachiopods use a slightly different mineral, and that preserves beautifully.
Does this part that we're looking at, is that indent in or is that showing it
So
coming
that's
out?
kind of a species really similar to this one. And so as far as the picture goes, one side goes in, and the other side pops out.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what that's actually supposed to represent. I think it's probably to go inside. Oh, good. See, we're having a great time. Oh, wow, you guys have like so many horn corals. All the boxes are a little bit different. Some are better in some groups and have not as great representatives in other groups.
I'm sure there's
You guys are the
rhizomes and crinoids in here too.
oh, absolutely.
Yep, I see little crinoids.
You kind of can't avoid them in Cincinnati age rocks.
Right.
They're just all over.
What's the
Falls of the Ohio rocks.
Yes, and those are Devonian, but tons of corals. The Devonian was the age of corals. Coral reefs were 10 times as extensive spatially as they are in the world today. So you can't avoid.
Right.
They're really fun. Oh,
what's
that,
the formation? Is this like a marker bed for this?
these are most common in the Liberty Formation. They occur kind of throughout a particular. There are 4 or 5 formations they occur throughout, but they're most common in the Liberty. And then these, the holes,
Yeah.
those are trace fossils. So that was a home for well, yeah, it was a dwelling structure.
Is that why? Well, I mean, like that's why they call it Trypanites because
Yeah, you're up on Trepanites.
I don't know.
I just said it.
Oh,
That, but like
She worked with Colin for her undergrad.
okay.
I was gonna say like in the field, I would never take the time to look for like secondary trace fossils. I would like pick these up,
Yeah.
float, and then just
Most of the corals, once they get to be a particular size, are bored by the worms. So little worms live there, and they made little houses. They're not eating the corals; they're using them for a home, much the way that organisms do with the modern coral reefs. All right, I think we're getting there. Do you have all yours under control? All right, so this guy is also a brachiopod. This is your clam. See that lump of crappy looking thing? So at this time, clams have shells that are made of mineral aragonite. They dissolve. And so in the Ordovician, brachiopods have really stable shells and clams don't. So that's pretty common there. But yeah, their clams are gross in general. Looks good. Everybody's got it. All right. Love it. Okay. All right then. Oh, sorry. Finish your comments. It's very, very good. All right. So I think everybody has got all of their things sorted and has had a chance to have some sort of chit chat with various folks helping out with Darwin Day. And so, if you were giving this to your students, and they've worked through it, you've identified things, depending on what kind of where you want to go with the lesson, you could of course have them identify things to higher levels. You could ask them to actually move these things to orders or families or genera using some of the classification tools such as the website or whatever you want to do, or you can just stop here. And so today we're going to stop here because we can make the points that I'm trying to teach in this particular lesson with this level of analysis. So first of all, you know, we can generate some statements. We can generate some anatomical descriptions for these different groups of fossils. So I'm going to focus on the difference between brachiopods and bivalves for right now, partly because I'm a brachiopod worker and I make sure everybody has to know this before they leave my presence. But all right, so how would you identify brachiopods? How would you describe those organisms? Okay, so you're bilateral symmetry. So yeah, when you have a plane of symmetry, ooh, I have a whiteboard. When you have a plane of symmetry like this, and you got a mirror, so one side looks like the other, that's bilateral symmetry. Okay, so in our brachiopod, the right and left sides of a single shell are mirror images, right? So like this side and that side on your shells look the same. What about the top and bottom of the shells? Are the two different shells identical to each other? No, they're quite different, right? Okay, and so that's one of the ways we can identify brachiopods is based on their symmetry. What else can you tell me about their shells, particularly them compared to the clams that you have? Okay, so you looked at lines. A lot of our brachiopods that you're looking at do have ornamentation that comes out this way. Some brachiopods can have concentric ornamentation, but the radial ribs are more common. What else? Tell me about the quality of preservation. The brachiopods are a lot better. The reason for that is the brachiopods are made of the mineral calcite, which is CaCO3, so it's calcium carbonate, but the way that the bonds form is referred to as mineral calcite. Now, calcite is very stable at Earth surface conditions, and so even though these fossils are 450 million years old, the calcite still looks really good. And you can identify a lot of details about their shell structure. They're also the most common thing you see out there. You've got a lot of brachiopods. And so brachiopods and bryozoans are the two most common types of organisms that you actually encounter in the Ordovician oceans. So those are great. Now let's talk about the clams, the bivalves. So how do you know that you have a bivalve? Okay, so our bivalves also have two shells. And sometimes some of the specimens that were actually weathered out, that some of your boxes had, you can see that. And when you do, your clams have kind of this kind of symmetry, in where the top and bottom shell well, my picture's not great. The top and bottom shells are mirror images of each other. But if you look at your shell on the side, the right and left sides are not. So the plane of symmetry in a brachiopod is perpendicular to the hinge. The plane of symmetry in a bivalve is parallel to the hinge. And that difference in symmetry from the start allows you to differentiate these groups really easily. So I've got some modern clams that I brought. So this is a modern one. And you can see I've got my two shells, and they look just like each other. And when I hinge them together, the right and left sides don't look like each other. And so we can see that happening, and you know, it's easy to mess with a modern clam. The other thing about clams is that their shell is made of a different mineral. It's also CaCO3. However, the bonding pattern between the elements, the atoms within there, is different, and it bonds into a hexagonal system called aragonite. Aragonite is not stable at Earth's surface conditions. And so over time, aragonite tends to dissolve. And so when you're looking at all of the clams in your boxes, they look like ugly lumps of mud, because what you have is a cast of the interior of the organism, and then the shell is gone. And so in some cases, there are a couple of clams out here that actually had some calcite, where you actually see those beautiful concentric rings, like maybe you guys have it. But for the most part, in the Ordovician, clams look like these big, ugly lumps. And so I think, therefore, we can all agree that brachiopods are awesome and clams are stupid. So, okay, good. Very important. Now, one other thing I'd like to point out is that we actually have a real difference. Even though these are both shelly animals with two shells, externally they share a lot of similarities. They both sit on the seafloor and filter feed, but their interiors are quite different. And so, think about clams for a minute. You can eat them, right? You can eat oysters and mussels, and what you're eating is the big fleshy foot, right? Brachiopods don't have a structure like that at all. The interior of a brachiopod, this one's a modern one. They're still alive. They're just not very common today. The interior of a brachiopod is mostly made up of its respiratory apparatus, and so it has nothing fleshy. They're not tasty. You don't eat them. In Japan, they eat one species, but that's it. Nobody else in the world eats them. There's just nothing tasty about them. And so even though they're externally quite similar, brachiopods are actually in a separate phylum, the phylum Brachiopoda, as opposed to the phylum Mollusca. They're really very different. Their early ontogeny is different. Their larvae are different. Everything about them is different. They just look kind of the same because they both have two shells. But even those, of course, as we've just described, are actually quite different. Now, if you go to the Ordovician seas and you are on the beach picking up shells, you're going to mostly find brachiopods. Almost all the things that were the dominant shellfish at that time, all the way up through the whole Paleozoic, really, are brachiopods. We don't get that domination of bivalves until after the Permo-Triassic mass extinction. Of course, today, if you go to the beach, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a brachiopod. They're still alive, but they live in cold water mostly, or they're very small, the size of your pinky fingernail, living in crevices inside of reefs. So they're not dead. We still have them. But you're just not going to randomly run into them the way that you run into bivalves. Bivalves today, of course, are very dominant and very much everywhere, and really fantastic mussels here in Tennessee, for example. Okay, so you can talk with your students about different ways you can identify things, so you can work through these different attributes. And then after you do that, after you've thought about these organisms, then the thing to ask the students to do then is to generate a claim about what is the environment in which these organisms were living. So you can say, okay, generate a claim, and then generate some supporting evidence. And they can do this in groups. And then you could put the different claims on the board and look at different pieces of evidence. So you may have students, depending on how you've led the discussion, the students could have more or less information at this point about the biology of these particular organisms. But overall, the students should at least know that there's a coral, because your sheet says coral, right? So if you ask the students what kind of environment these live in, your students should return with at least some sort of aqueous answer, and probably oceans, if they know much about corals, but they might not know a lot about corals. And so they might tell you, oh, maybe it was a river. And that's okay. So answers that are incorrect are actually really useful ways to analyze evidence. So on the board, you could write the different hypotheses. So our different claims are, we have ocean, or we have beach, or we have river. And then underneath there, we can put the different lines of evidence. And then we could compare and contrast and have a discussion about this is data. Fossils are data. You have data. And from there, you want to analyze this question of, so what was the environment? And so you can work through it. And eventually, of course, you can get to the explanation, in which we actually can then talk about using our scientific principles to actually evaluate what environment was present here. And so we can start with that claim, look through our evidence, talk about our reasoning, and then we can go through the rebuttal process. So we can say, okay, well, I think it's a river, and I think it's a river because clams live in rivers. Lots of mussels here in Tennessee. They live in rivers. And you say, okay, well, so we've got some reasoning, and then you could ask another student, well, is there a rebuttal? And say, okay, well, but there are also corals. And corals don't live in rivers. Corals today only live in the ocean. And so then you can also pull in attributes of uniformitarianism. So using the present biology of relatives to think about the past. Now the corals that you have in the Ordovician fall into two kinds. There's the horn corals, the rugosans that we looked at. There are also tabulate corals. Both of those orders of corals are completely extinct today. We have these beautiful corals alive today, the scleractinian corals, but they're a totally different group. And so you could, depending on how you want to go, say, okay, well, so modern corals live in the ocean, but these are actually different. So what evidence do we have that these live in the ocean? And then you could go to other organisms, so brachiopods, for example. Brachiopods have a very particular respiratory system that cannot tolerate fresh water. There's never been a freshwater brachiopod ever in the history of anything. And so, again, we can look at not just the corals, but we can look at more of the fauna. We say, okay, but not only are there corals, we also have brachiopods, and those also are only in the oceans. And so you can start building up multiple lines of evidence that supports an ocean interpretation. Another thing you might want to talk about is, well, how deep is this ocean? And so again, we can think about modern animals, and we can look at the shells. So a lot of the brachiopods you have big shells, and you only have big shells if you're being buffeted by waves, right? Because organisms are lazy. You're going to do the minimum that you can to live, to acquire resources, to mate, and do the things you need to do. You're not going to build an extra giant shell if it doesn't help you. If a thin shell is going to be good enough, you'll have a thin shell. So these guys with big shells, that means that they're actually adapted to some energetic conditions. They want to be stable on the seafloor rather than knock around, because knocking around is going to get you buried and kill you when you didn't want to be dead. So, so you can think about these different ways to talk about that kind of stuff too. Okay, and then here you could pull in these kind of things if you want to. Okay, so after you've looked through these things, you can then explain and elaborate. And so then we can think about, okay, what was the environment like 450 million years ago? And it can build up this image of, okay, well, we've got trace fossils here. And the trace fossils look like trails, right? All the trails we had. And that means the substrate has to be muddy. Think about making a footprint. If it's really hard, like asphalt, you're not leaving a footprint. You're going to leave a footprint where it's soupy. And so we can start building a detailed picture, or less detailed, depending on kind of where you want to go. And so we can think about that. And then this is my favorite part. Once we've reconstructed the environment, then we can ask the students, well, does this environment still exist here today? So these fossils are from Ohio. Is there an ocean in Ohio today? Clearly not. Or you could so you could talk about that. You could also talk about, okay, well, there is still an ocean today. Where is the ocean? Okay, so it's off the coast, over in the Carolinas or Florida. And then we could say, well, if we go to the ocean there, is this the group of organisms that you find in the ocean there? And of course, it's not, because we are really not going to find a lot of brachiopods, and the horned corals are extinct. Trilobites are extinct. Crinoids are around, but like the brachiopods, super uncommon. And so the animals that we see, even if we go to the same environment, are actually quite different. And so there are a couple ways we can talk about change through time. We can talk about change in the environment in a single location. So you're like, okay, well, why isn't there an ocean in Ohio today? Why not? Anybody have ideas? Why don't we have an ocean right over here in Tennessee? What changed? Tectonic position changed. At the time that we were in the oceans, we were at about 20 degrees south of the equator. We're in the tropics. And as far as tectonics, it's actually great, because the other thing going on in the Ordovician is that there were more continents. So today we have some pretty big continents. At the time, there were more smaller continents. And related to that, there were a lot of subduction zones in the ocean, divergence zones. So think about the Mid-Atlantic Rift, right, going down the middle of the ocean. That's a gigantic underwater mountain range, right? So if you made a giant underwater mountain range, or just a scale of one, you stuck it in your bathtub, what would happen to the water on the sides of your bathtub? It would go up, right? And it might flood some things, depending on how big your model is. And we actually, in the Ordovician, we have a lot of these rift zones. And so there was actually, so the water was being kicked out. Whenever there's a lot of rifting going on, that happens. And so we see the same thing. That's one of the reasons C was so high in the Cretaceous. Another reason C was high, in the Ordovician, the world was a bit warmer. And so what happens if there are no ice caps on the planet? Right, it melts, all that water goes into the oceans come up on land, right? We're dealing with a lot of that now. And so we can talk about these couple different things. So the location of the plate changed, the Earth was warmer, and it had more of these divergent zones. And so altogether, that resulted in actually flooding of the continents. So the continents were flooded, and they're not today. And so we can talk about that's one type of change through time. And the other thing we can talk about, of course, is that the environment's different, or that the critters that live in the oceans are different. And so we can pull back the idea that, okay, well, this is a modern coral. It's really different. We can talk about the brachiopod to bivalve transition in dominance. And so some of these large-scale patterns that exist in the history of life, we can pull this kind of stuff back in. Okay, so we can talk through these things, and that's what I really like about this lesson is using local rocks that students can collect, things they can hold that are actually raw data, and from there your students can actually think through the fact that things have changed. They can see that they've changed. Tennessee isn't the same. They can see how that's changed, and you can work with them to help them understand what are the underlying reasons for some of those changes. So, and there are various ways you could incorporate this. So if you want to talk about that the critters in the oceans have changed, if that's kind of the angle you want to take, you can have them go research. What are the major components of, a reef around Florida? And are they the same as what we see here in the Tennessee rocks? And so there are a variety of ways you can work with this depending on the main points you're trying to get across. The other thing that you can do is this is a thing called a Raft, which is a writing assignment. We were doing a lot of incorporating literacy in with scientific constructs. So of course the ability to understand science, you have to be able to communicate it back out. If you can explain it to someone else, of course, then you understand a topic much better. And so the evaluation activity that we were using here it's called a Raft. It's an essay, and the Raft stands for the role, audience, format, and topic. And so this is, has anybody used the Raft schemes before? I like them, they're fun. What a Raft is it's an essay of some sort that gives the students, well, you as the teacher can choose how much latitude to give your students. So the first thing you want that student to decide is, who are they as the writer? So they can take a role. They could take a role of a newspaper reporter that got on a time machine and went back to the Ordovician. They could be a Brachiopod talking to his buddy and hey, cousin Brachiopod, how's it going? So there's a lot of flexibility and creativity that could be employed here. So you could be a fossil, you could be a present day organism, you could be, a paleontologist, you could be a time traveler, you could take a bunch of different kind of tacks with this. And then decide who you're writing to as your audience. What kind of format? So are they writing, a letter? Are they a diary entry, a day in the life of a horn coral? A scientific report, travel log, complaining. Maybe they're really annoyed, dear clams, I really don't like you. So there are a variety of ways you could go with this. And then of course, what is the topic? So if you wanted to talk about, kind of the Brachiopod is really annoyed because people keep thinking he's a clam and he's just not a clam, and so it's a complaint. Or, a time traveler going back saying, oh my gosh, the seas were amazing. This is what Tennessee used to look like, and I'm reporting back from my trip to Tennessee. Or any variety of things. But of course, as the teacher, you can control, how you want this to go, or you could make it really free form. Who knows? Whatever works best for your class, which of course you have a lot of expertise understanding. But there's a lot of ways you could take this. And you could also run it in a couple of ways. You could have them all report back about the rocks that they just studied. Or you could ask them to investigate at a different time. So maybe you want them to talk about what Tennessee was like at a different point in time, maybe the Pleistocene. You say, okay, well, I want to talk about, when the woolly mammoth mastodons are here, or the jaguars, or short-faced bears. Or maybe you took a field trip to the Gray fossil site, and you want to talk about those attributes of what it was like in the Miocene 5 million years ago. So there are lots of different ways you could run this, and you can ask them to either just kind of rework the aspects of the lesson that you directly had, or you could ask them to actually investigate another interval of Earth history, another environmental time. So there are lots of different ways to work with this. And of course that ties into Common Core standards on literacy in a variety of ways. So depending on what you choose to do, we talked about kind of using a series of literacy strategies like think, pair, share. We could add a science vocabulary word wall. So the new words you learned, you can put them on the giant pieces of you know what I mean, the big sticky, the Post-it notes. Those are so cool. I didn't know about those until I started working with my teacher education faculty. Those are the best. So those, generating written descriptions and observations. Here in the Explore section, in the Explain section, we were talking about synthesizing data to understand things, and then writing assignment at the end. So if you work collaboratively with your reading or English ELA folks, you can work on things in that context, and you could actually run this as a cross-departmental curriculum if that's the kind of thing that sounds fun too. So there's all kinds of ways you can work with this. All right, so that's kind of my Oceans of Ohio lesson plan. So let me hand that out to you. Whoops. I always like to do handouts at the end so you pay attention while I talk. I learned this trick with college students because they rarely pay attention when I talk. Oh, sure. Thanks. Okay. Now we have one last lesson plan that's fun that we're going to run through. And I'm not going to cover everything up here. But what I do want to do is shuffle some cards. Hey, Jen, come here. All right, hand these out. Okay, so what we're going to do now is talk about another kind of lesson plan. Paleontology is not only great for talking about deep time, we can also apply this to a lot of problems in the modern world. One of the key problems we have in the modern world are invasive species. Things like kudzu are a gigantic nightmare around here, for example. And so one of the things we can do in the fossil record is try to find out what are going to be the long-term impacts of things that are happening today. So today, we have invasive species. We can go track them. We can study them on decadal scales. We've got ecologists doing a lot of this. But understanding what's going to happen over thousands or tens of thousands of years is actually a lot harder because humans don't live that long. And so, but there's been things like invasions in the fossil record. And so this activity that we're going to work through is one where we actually look at kind of long-term impacts about invasive species, looking at the relationship between species persistence, whether they're specialists or generalists in their ecology, and the impact invasive species on ecosystem structure and how that relates to speciation. So I have a lesson plan written down for this one too. But first of all, we can just explore by setting the scene. And so you all have a card, which is great. Okay, so everybody that has a species, okay, so take a step back. In Cincinnati, the rocks at the bottom have a bunch of species living in them. And they've been living there for 5 million years. But then we cross a rock layer and a whole bunch of species move in that haven't been there before. They haven't been in this area for 5 million years. They come in and the ecosystem fundamentally changes. So these guys are invasive species, just like modern invasive species. They come in and they change the environment. So let's explore what happens with these invasive species. So first of all, let's explore a little bit about your card. So who has a native species? If your card says native, put your card up. I like the color. All right, so native species. Great. Who is an invasive species? Ooh, boo. Okay, now of your native species and invasive species, who is a specialist, ecological specialist? Occupies a relatively limited set. Okay, who's a generalist? All right, so we've got some of both. Let's get this back on. Okay, let's look at our fossils. So who's got a brachipod? Brachipod folks, you're my favorite. Okay, so look at our brachipod colors. We've got brachiopods that are native, and we've got brachiopods that are invasive. Great. What about horn corals? Who's a horn coral? All of our horn corals are invasive. There were none in the pre-invasion interval. No corals. Okay. Trilobites. Who's a trilobite? All right, we got some trilobites, some native trilobites, some invasive trilobites. Clams. All right, we got some clams. And gastropods, who are snails. All right, and snails fall into all kinds of categories. All right, so one of the things we can see as we go through and we raise our cards up is that we can see that there's a collection of colors, right? And so since each color represents either a native specialist, the four colors are native specialist, native generalist, invasive specialist, and invasive generalist. And so when we look at the color patterns, like I say, raise your hand if you're a brachiopod or a snail, we can see there's a constellation of colors. And so those clades actually fall into multiple types of these categories. Okay, so let's explore survivorship. Okay, so let's work through it exactly like I wrote it down. If you are a native species, raise your card. All right, now you guys were all here before the invaders came. And life was great. You were super happy. If you're a specialist, put your card down. You just went extinct. Okay, generalists, you persist. Good job. Now, I'm sorry, specialists, but none of you make it to the post-invasion interval, and we've studied this a lot. Okay, now, generalists, you're still alive, so that's super. Now, everybody that invades, come on in. Join the group. Join the group, invaders. All right, if you're an invasive specialist, put your card down. You go extinct. I'm sorry. All right, so what we have now is just a bunch of generalist species. Okay, put your cards down. All right, now, so our generalist species versus specialist species, one of the key things that we see going on across this invasion interval is that anything that is ecologically specialized does not persist. If you think about what happens during the invasion, we're not talking about big fish coming in and eating things. We're not talking about predation. We're actually talking about a competitive system. So under the competitive regime, species that are more specialized have a harder time acquiring resources when a lot of generalized species come in. And so in this Cincinnati area, all of the specialists go extinct. Some of the invaders tried to be specialists, but even they couldn't make it. And so we're left with a bunch of species, all of which are generalists. So if you are still a surviving generalist, put your card back up. Let's explore what kind of species are making it in this world. Do we have any brachiopods? Yeah. Do we have any horn corals? Yeah. Do we have any trilobites? Super clams. Yeah, I know. And gastropods. Awesome. All right, so great, thanks. So what we can see here is it's not what kind of animal you are. We had all of our different groups of animals surviving as part of the post-invasion fauna. It's not if you're a trilobite or if you're a coral. It's actually about how broad your niche is. And so we see this pattern very dramatically in the modern world too, of course. Now, if you think about, for example, all the kinds of things that are having a hard time surviving today. So what traits are related to survivorship? So if you think about, who's doing awesome in this current climate change, global change, human movement world in which we live in, it's generalist species, things like cockroaches, pigeons, white-tailed deer. They're doing great. Who's not doing great? Tell me about a species that's having a hard time. Just list one. Polar bears, right. Polar bears are so cute. We have a baby one at the Columbus Zoo. It's like this big and it's so amazing. Yeah, they're screwed. So they have a really specialized ecology. They're going to be around in zoos. My baby polar bear will probably do great because we're going to take care of it. But the ones living in the wild, their habitat is being rapidly lost. And at this point, there's enough climate inertia that we probably really can't preserve that environment. We could probably invest a lot of money in it if we'd like to, but we probably can't preserve their habitat. So that's the kind of species that's very specialized, is very likely to have a very difficult time in the modern world. And so you can start with this idea of, okay, what happened in the past and where nobody has any personal ethical connections to whether or not, I don't like clams, but outside of that, nobody really cares about what happened in the Ordovician. Nothing's at stake. Nobody is going to get personally affronted about discussing who did or didn't live in the Ordovician. And then from there, you can actually take it back into something that's much more relevant to modern society, where people actually have kind of very strongly held personal beliefs about what animals they think are cute and snuggly. And, we as humans really like to save cute, snuggly stuff. It's deeply ingrained in the way that we process things. The more closely related species are to ourselves, the more strongly we actually feel like conserving them. And so you can actually kind of use this to get at some of these questions and build some discussions about, what are the right choices to make. So from here you could elaborate. You can always end with a raft because it's always fun. But you can consider different ways of talking about what species are alive today and how these attributes of their ecology have a big impact on how they're faring in the modern world or in the next 100 years. And so you can also tie fossils back into these kinds of things. So paleontology can be a useful way to kind of use these as leverages to begin conversations that can become a little bit more difficult. But you can always tie back and go back to, okay, but what happened in the Ordovician? People weren't involved. Nobody made any choices about which species to try and save. What happens in a natural system when these kinds of things happen? There's always change. That's the one constant about the geologic record, right? It's always changing. The climate is always changing. The species are always moving. Natural populations are always undergoing adaptation. These things are always happening. And we can look at the fossil record as a way to gain some insight about what may happen in the long term for today, and also as a way that's kind of a neutral ground on some of these things that are kind of emotionally charged issues. Okay, so I have a handout for that lesson plan. Oh, no, you can keep them. I like to, this is a lesson I often do with public, and they like to, it's nice because it gives you a little personal investment in whether your species survives or not. And sometimes people are like, I was so bummed, I went out right away. But it works, you know, it's a nice kind of way to talk about some of these things. So in conclusion, the fossil record is a great place to build into a lot of kind of Earth system or environmental change through time, but we can also talk about biotic change through time, even issues that are really relevant in the modern. We can actually get at them with the fossil record. And so using authentic data is really useful. So taking actual fossils that are real and physical entities works really well as a way to kind of get into these things. The 5E learning cycle is a lot of fun. Because you start with that explore phase, students have the opportunity to kind of feel some connection with the material and generate some questions in their own head, like what is this weird thing? How was this thing living? And get a little bit more engaged before you move into the explanatory phase as well. So it can be a really powerful way to work in the classroom. This also works with outreach. So again, on our website, the Ordovician Atlas, we have the lessons we talked about today, all the handouts like the cards. You can print those there as well. We also have a lesson plan about geologic time. So, you know, making a 4.6 meter long string, putting cards on it and talking about, you know, the fact that everything interesting happens like in the last half a meter. And so we have a lesson plan that standards aligned for that one as well. And so there are a couple different things, and so check it out if you work in lessons that you think some of the stuff could be useful. Also, my contact info is around somewhere. I was thinking it's not really readily available on the website, actually. But I'll just pass my cards around. Oh, it's on that sheet. Perfect. Okay, you have my contact info. That's perfect, yeah. So yeah, feel free to email me if you're working on any of these things, you have questions, or I know that one of the barriers when you're implementing fossil-based activities from the teachers that I work with in Cincinnati is that students always ask a lot of questions, which is great. But I've learned that sometimes teachers feel that they are not expert enough or feel uncomfortable not being able to directly answer every question your students ask. And I actually fully appreciate that a lot. And so some of these tools for identification can help with that. But also if there's anything that you have a question with, shoot me an email. I'm very happy to help talk or Skype with your class or whatever. So thanks. And I'll be around all day, so we can talk some more. But I am technically out of time. So thanks for coming. Right. But if you want to hold some fossils or clams. Oh, questions. Shoot. I forgot I was supposed to ask for questions.
Do you guys have any questions for Alicia? I can kind of bring this over.
Hi, I actually didn't introduce myself to you guys, so I think I'll say give myself an introduction because I was just cold and handing you parking passes. But I'm Mia Wawrek, and I am a research coordinator in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology on campus. So I'm not a grad student, I'm not faculty, I don't teach per se, but I'm kind of in this middle ground and interested in teaching. So one of the things that has come up in ecology recently as kind of like this lost skill is the skill of identifying species out in the field. And I was wondering, when you teach this to your students, how can you, how do you tell them why identification is an important skill and how that can actually lead you to answering questions, broader questions?
Right.
Because a lot of people are just like, well, who cares if you can identify that plant or whatever.
Right. Well, actually, I mean, the lost skill of identification is actually quite a substantial problem within the biological and paleontological sciences in general. But fundamentally, fossils and organisms are the basic data that we have in biology and paleontology. And without being able to actually say what that thing is in front of you, there's no way you can actually get at what is the environment or how old are these rocks. And so, or here in the Smokies, they're trying to do bioblitzes and identify all the species that are present in the park, and they actually can't find people that are specialists in some of the groups, like millipedes and things like that are really hard to find. And so, yeah, it's really important because if we want to understand the Earth, like what our critters are like, if we want to think about what we'd like it to be in the future, we actually have to know what's present to start with. And so much of diversity is unexplored in the modern that's really hard. With the fossils, we mostly have a pretty good sense of what the primary species are, the common ones, throughout time. Unless it's a new deposit we haven't worked with, or even in things like Cincinnati, we find new species, even though people have been crawling over these rocks for 200 years. But being able to actually identify what you're looking at is the only way that you can actually make any inferences about anything, because that is the basic data on which all this rests. Thanks. Yeah.
We have to teach about dichotomous keys.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have a good website, or do you all have one on here that is about identifying fossils that is a dichotomous key?
Right. So dichotomous keys. So the question is, do we have any useful, helpful items for dichotomous keys? There is actually one of the books that we have in Ohio is called Fossils of Ohio. It's a tremendous book. It only costs $30, but it's like 500 pages of pictures of fossils, complete with dichotomous keys. So typically, dichotomous keys are used in biology. They're really broadly used by plant biologists, and less so by animal workers. But that is a case that you actually have existing dichotomous keys for fossils.
So fossils are not always easy materials to come by when you're constructing these lesson plans. Outside of fossil kits that teachers will be receiving today, what are some good resources to get large numbers of fossils that you can work with your students that are cost effective?
Right. Well, so the question is, so it's not always easy to find fossils. And so, I'm very fortunate in that I live 2 hours from these rocks. And anytime I need more, I go drive and get them. And so but actually from here, Cincinnati is a 4-hour drive. So if you wanted a pile of fossils, you could just drive to the greater Cincinnati area, grab a backseat full of fossils, and have rocks like these. These ones that I had in the boxes are just the kind of things you pick up on the side of the road. They're not special. They weren't prepared. We washed them a little bit with a toothbrush, and that's it. So these are the kind of fossils you can just easily pick up. So when I do a lot of group presentations and it's the right season, I'll often collect things to give out. So that's kind of, collecting fossils like this is really easy if you're in the right places. From here, it's not too far to be in the right place. It's a little far to take a class on a field trip, of course. But if you want to take a day and go grab some fossils, have like a fun family adventure, that's really easy to do from here. Road trip. I'll meet you in the field. Tell me when you're coming, and we'll all hang out together.
There are
For me,
some
it's a 3-hour
fossil
drive.
deposits kind of near Norris Lake with the same sort of critters. And then, Clinch Mountain, where we take the paleo field trip every year, we can get directions to that if you guys are interested. There's a gas station you can park at, and you kind of just flock to the hill and drop to the ground, and you can find essentially all of these fossils and some cool echinoderms as well. Yeah. Any other questions for Alicia? Okay, let's give her another round of applause.